At exactly 0912 local time, over the southwestern ice sheet of Greenland, two Royal Danish Air Force F-16AM Fighting Falcons pulled alongside a United States Air Force C-17 Globemaster III and locked their AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles onto its engines. 129 American soldiers were sitting in the cargo bay. No windows, no ejection seats, no awareness that two NATO allies were pointing weapons at their aircraft using targeting computers paid for with collective defense funds. The Danish flight lead transmitted on the International Guard frequency. His voice was controlled and precise, the way pilots sound when they are genuinely prepared to do what they are saying they will do. The American crew had authorization from Greenland's provisional government to land at Ilulissat Airport. Copenhagen had a different view of who had the authority to grant that authorization. And somewhere in the gap between those two legal positions, 131 people's lives had become a constitutional question with a military answer standing by. This was the moment the Greenland crisis stopped being theoretical. To understand how two NATO allies ended up with weapons locked on each other over the Arctic, you have to understand what had been building for 3 months. The United States had been conducting direct negotiations with Greenland's newly formed Provisional Independence Council, the political body that emerged after Greenland's parliament passed a non-binding resolution on self-determination in the autumn. Washington had been careful to frame these contacts as support for Greenlandic democratic expression. Copenhagen had been equally careful to frame them as a systematic attempt to bypass Danish sovereignty over a territory that, under the Danish constitution, remained an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark regardless of what any provisional council said. The 1951 Defense Agreement gave the United States the right to operate military installations in Greenland with Danish consent. That word, consent, was doing enormous work in the diplomatic cables flying between Washington and Copenhagen during those 3 months. The Americans argued that Greenlandic authorities constituted a legitimate consent-granting body for operations on Greenlandic soil. The Danes argued that Danish constitutional law made that position legally absurd, and that any American military movement into Greenland without Copenhagen's explicit authorization was a violation of the agreement that had governed the relationship for 75 years. Then Washington sent the C-17. The official mission designation was Joint Training Support, transport 129 Army Rangers to participate in exercises with Greenlandic security forces at Ilulissat. The Rangers' equipment load told a more operational story. Communications infrastructure for an independent forward operating base. Defensive weapons. 30 days of supplies. The kind of footprint you establish when you want to demonstrate that you are present and intend to remain present before anyone can formally object. Denmark had been tracking the aircraft since it departed Thule Air Base. Copenhagen's foreign ministry had been transmitting protests through every available diplomatic channel since the mission was announced. When the C-17 crossed into what Danish authorities considered protected airspace on approach to Ilulissat, the order to intercept had already been drafted and signed. The F-16AM stationed at the newly upgraded Ilulissat facility had been in alert status for 6 hours. Now let's talk about what that weapons lock actually meant in technical terms, because the gap between weapons locked and weapon fired is smaller than most people understand when the missile involved is an AIM-9X Block II. The AIM-9X is not the heat-seeking missile of popular imagination, a simple infrared seeker that chases the hottest thing in its field of view. The Block II version carries a focal plane array seeker that builds a complete thermal image of its target environment, distinguishing between genuine aircraft heat signatures and decoy flares by analyzing the shape and movement pattern of the infrared source rather than simply its intensity. It features thrust vector control, small fins at the missile's exhaust nozzle that redirect the rocket plume to steer the weapon independently of its aerodynamic control surfaces, allowing it to pull maneuvers exceeding 60 G during terminal intercept. It carries a 9.4 kilogram blast fragmentation warhead specifically engineered to maximize structural damage to aircraft. Against a C-17 Globemaster III, none of these capabilities were particularly relevant to the outcome. The C-17 was not going to evade an AIM-9X. The aircraft has an AN/AAR-47 missile warning system and an AN/ALE-47 countermeasures dispenser. Both are real systems that provide real capability against older infrared-guided weapons. Against the Block II focal plane array seeker at the range the Danish F-16S were holding, they were providing psychological comfort more than tactical protection. The Globemaster was built to carry 77 tons of cargo into austere airstrips under difficult conditions. It was not built to survive a within-visual range engagement with a fourth-generation fighter, carrying current production air-to-air missiles. The aircraft's 4 Pratt & Whitney F117 engines each burn at temperatures that make them prominent infrared sources. The fuselage creates aerodynamic heating visible to thermal imaging. At the distance the Danish pilots were holding, the missile's seeker had a targeting solution that required no further refinement. Captain Anders Müller, the Danish flight lead, had been in the Air Force for 17 years. He had flown F-16S over Afghanistan and Libya in support of NATO operations. He had trained alongside American pilots at red flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base. The aircraft he was flying had been upgraded at the same facility that maintained American F-16Es. The missile on his wingtip rail had been manufactured in Troy, Alabama. He understood exactly what he was holding. He understood what firing it would mean for the alliance. He also understood his orders. Inside the cargo bay, the Rangers had no direct awareness of the intercept. The loadmaster had heard the radio exchange and knew what it meant, standing in the forward section of the hold, watching 129 soldiers who were following the operational routine of a transport flight. Equipment secured, weapons cased, waiting for arrival. The intercom carried the pilots' voices, but not the Danish transmissions. The Rangers were passengers in a situation they couldn't see. The C-17's pilots had 3 choices. Continue the approach and force the Danes to decide whether their weapons lock was real. Turn back immediately and concede the mission. Stall for time while Washington processed what was happening. Major Rebecca Torres, the aircraft commander, keyed the radio. Danish aircraft. We are operating under authorization from Greenlandic provisional authorities under the provisions of the 1951 agreement. We request you stand down. The Danish response was immediate and specific. The 1951 agreement requires Danish government authorization. The Provisional Council does not constitute the Danish government. You are ordered to alter course to Thule immediately. 4 minutes passed. During those 4 minutes, the diplomatic cables between Washington and Copenhagen ran at a tempo that the State Department later described as the most intensive single exchange in the alliance's history that didn't involve an Article 5 invocation. The core problem was that both sides were legally correct within their own framework, and neither framework had a mechanism for resolving the conflict without one of them conceding a position that carried enormous downstream consequences. If Washington ordered the C-17 to land, it was acknowledging that the Provisional Council's authorization was insufficient, which undermined the entire diplomatic architecture it had been building around Greenlandic self-determination for 3 months. If Copenhagen fired on the aircraft, it was shooting down a NATO ally's military transport over a constitutional dispute, which would trigger an Article 5 consultation process that nobody had a playbook for in a context where the aggressor and the victim were both members of the same alliance. Both capitals understood that whichever decision came out of those 4 minutes would define the Greenland situation for years. One was a diplomatic setback. The other was the end of something that had been built across 75 years and 2 generations of alliance management. Mueller's finger was on the weapons release. The targeting computer continued updating its intercept solution. The AIM-9X seeker continued holding lock on the C-17's port inboard engine. The order came from Washington at 0926. Abort approach. Return to Thule. Acknowledge. Major Torres acknowledged. She began a gradual left turn away from Ilulissat, away from the Danish interceptors, away from the 4 minutes that had brought the Atlantic Alliance to a point where 2 allies with American-built aircraft had been seconds from shooting at each other. Mueller watched the C-17's infrared signature begin to decrease as the aircraft turned and the aspect angle changed. His seeker's lock tone diminished. He held position for 90 seconds to confirm the American aircraft was committed to departure, then transmitted to his wingman and to the Ilulissat ground controller. American transport departing airspace. Intercept terminated. Returning to patrol. The C-17 landed at Thule 47 minutes later. The Rangers offloaded their equipment. Nobody had fired. Nobody had died. The mission had failed completely. The cost accounting requires a different framework from a conventional military engagement, because nothing was destroyed, and the numbers are almost insultingly small relative to what almost happened. Denmark expended approximately $55,000 in fuel and maintenance costs to intercept 1 American transport and hold it at weapons range for 4 minutes. In exchange, it demonstrated to Washington that its red lines in Greenland were enforced positions rather than diplomatic preferences, revealed to American intelligence analysts its F-16 scramble response times and patrol patterns around the Ilulissat installation, and established a precedent that Copenhagen would apply military means to defend its constitutional position on Greenland, regardless of alliance complications. The United States spent approximately $160,000 to transport 129 Rangers to a landing they never made. The mission failed in its immediate objective. More significantly, it produced a diplomatic situation that required months of repair work in the alliance relationship, validated Copenhagen's position that Washington had been attempting an end run around Danish sovereignty, and generated an intercept incident that every NATO member studied carefully for its implications about how territorial disputes between alliance members would actually be handled when they became military questions. Total direct expenditure from both sides, under $220,000. The indirect costs in alliance trust, in diplomatic capital, in the credibility of the legal frameworks both governments had been publicly defending, were not quantifiable and not recoverable through any mechanism either side had a clean path to. The broader implications traveled further than Greenland. Russia's Arctic Command had been watching the Greenland situation with the specific interest of a party that benefits from NATO fracture lines. The intercept demonstrated something Moscow's analysts had been modeling but lacked direct evidence for: that sovereignty disputes between alliance members produce genuine operational friction, that the automatic mutual defense logic of Article 5 had practical limits when the threat came from within the alliance rather than from outside it, and that Washington's unilateral approach to Greenlandic self-determination had created a category of conflict that NATO had no established mechanism for resolving. The ice sheet that had been a demonstration of American Arctic presence ambition became a demonstration of alliance limitation instead. China's assessments focused on a different dimension. Beijing had been watching the American strategic posture in the Arctic with the interest of a power whose own territorial disputes involve territories administered by governments that may not align with the central government's position. The Greenland situation provided a real-world test case of what happens when a major power attempts to establish a military presence in disputed territory by working around rather than through the sovereign government. The answer in this case was that the sovereign government scrambled fighters and held weapons lock for 4 minutes. Beijing filed that data point. Every NATO ally with its own territorial complexities, countries with overseas territories, countries with autonomy arrangements, countries with historical disputes about where their borders actually lie, recalibrated their understanding of how the alliance handled situations where one member's strategic interest conflicted with another member's constitutional position. The answer they arrived at was that the alliance handled it by nearly having its members shoot at each other and then backing down when the stakes became unambiguous. The hardened shelters at Ilulissat got their F-35s. Copenhagen completed the upgrade on schedule. The Provisional Council in Nuuk continued its political process. Washington continued supporting Greenlandic self-determination through diplomatic channels that were more carefully coordinated with Copenhagen than the C-17 mission had been. None of it restored the 4 minutes that had passed over the ice sheet at 0912. Those 4 minutes existed in the record now, studied by everyone who needed to understand where alliance solidarity ended and sovereign enforcement began. The AIM-9X that Captain Muller had locked onto a C-17 full of American soldiers was designed and built in the United States, sold to Denmark as part of a collective defense arrangement, and aimed at Americans because the collective defense arrangement turned out to have conditions that neither side had fully thought through when they signed the 1951 agreement in a different world with different problems. Technology doesn't adjudicate legal disputes. It enforces positions, and the position Copenhagen was enforcing that morning, that Danish sovereignty over Greenland was a real constraint and not a diplomatic abstraction, turned out to be exactly as real as the weapons lock that backed it. The C-17 flew back to Thule, the Rangers went home, the F-16s returned to their shelters. And somewhere in the gap between what the 1951 agreement said and what a Provisional Independence Council's authorization meant, the alliance that had defined Western security for 3 generations discovered that it had no settled answer to the question it had just been asked. That question is still open. The ice sheet remembers 4 minutes. The rest of it is still being written. If this breakdown changed how you think about alliances and the limits of collective defense, share it and subscribe. The crises that nearly happen are sometimes the ones that matter most.